He was simply surveying the seabed and didn't expect anything unusual. But the Trojan horse he found turned out to be real and was hiding inside something that shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The contract arrived without ceremony, folded into the steady rhythm of routine work that defined the company's operations. It was not the kind of assignment that promised headlines or celebration, only a set of coordinates, a time window constrained by weather forecasts, and a clear commercial purpose. A private maritime firm had been commissioned to survey and map a stretch of Mediterranean seabed that had remained largely untouched by modern exploration. The stated goal was practical and unromantic: verify the absence of large obstructions before future industrial activity could proceed. Pipelines, cables, shipping lanes, insurance assessments. These were the forces that shaped such missions. History, when it appeared, was usually incidental. The company specialized in operating along that thin boundary where commerce brushed against archaeology. Its crews were trained to recognize when metal and stone ceased to be debris and became heritage. Officially, the protocol was strict. Any object of potential historical value required immediate reporting, suspension of work, and the involvement of state authorities or academic institutions. In practice, the first hours after a discovery were a gray zone. Those hours determined how a find would be interpreted, documented, and remembered. Precision mattered. So did restraint. The expedition assembled in a modest port city whose harbors had seen centuries of departures and returns. The docks bore the scars of constant use: salt-stained concrete, rusted bollards, coils of rope darkened by age and oil. The research vessel itself was utilitarian, stripped of anything ornamental. Cranes rose from its deck like skeletal arms. Hydraulic winches were bolted into reinforced frames, and containers filled with equipment were stacked with careful balance. Nothing on board suggested romance or adventure. Everything spoke of function, efficiency, and risk management. Among the crew was the company's lead diver, a dark-skinned man whose presence was both unassuming and quietly authoritative. Years of experience had shaped him into someone who wasted no movement and no words. His work history included deep inspections of damaged hulls, the recovery of lost cargo, and long hours spent in waters where visibility collapsed into nothingness within arm's reach. He had learned to trust procedures more than instinct, but also to listen to the subtle signals that equipment and environment provided. The sea, he knew, rarely announced danger directly. It suggested it through small deviations that only the attentive noticed. His role on this mission was clear. While remote-operated vehicles and sonar systems would handle the bulk of the survey, any anomaly that resisted easy classification would eventually require human assessment. Machines could map shapes and densities, but only a diver could interpret texture, scale, and intent. He carried the responsibility of making those judgments, often alone, suspended between the vessel above and the seabed below. Preparations unfolded with the practiced rhythm of routine. Sonar arrays were calibrated, navigation systems synchronized, and data feeds tested. Weather reports were checked repeatedly. The Mediterranean was calm on the surface, but currents below could shift without warning, especially near underwater formations that redirected flow. The crew understood the narrow margins they were working within. Each dive window was measured not only in minutes, but in acceptable levels of risk. As the vessel left the harbor and moved towards the designated zone, the coastline receded into a pale line against the sky. The diver reviewed maps and charts that showed little more than depth gradients and historical shipping routes. There were no markers indicating wrecks, no notes suggesting prior discoveries. The area had been bypassed for decades, deemed uninteresting or impractical to explore. That neglect was precisely why it had been chosen. The first hours at sea passed without incident. Sonar sweeps traced the contours of the seabed, translating invisible landscapes into shifting patterns of light and shadow on monitors. Most readings were predictable. Natural rock formations appeared as irregular masses, while modern debris registered as thin, fragmented signals. The operators cataloged each anomaly methodically, tagging and clearing them from further concern. Then a shape emerged that disrupted the pattern. It appeared initially as a dense, unified mass, its outline unusually coherent. The signal did not fracture or blur as others did. It held its form across multiple passes, resisting the explanations typically applied to submerged debris. The operators adjusted angles and frequencies, refining the image. With each refinement, the object's symmetry became more apparent. The diver was called to the monitoring station. He studied the display in silence, noting proportions and edges that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The object was large, far larger than any single piece of modern refuse. It did not resemble a shipwreck, nor did it align with the geometry of industrial equipment. Its placement was equally perplexing. It rested on a relatively flat section of seabed, isolated from other debris, as though it had been set there rather than scattered by catastrophe. Discussions followed, cautious and technical. Some suggested it might be a modern installation, an abandoned structure or art piece. Others pointed out inconsistencies. The depth was significant, the corrosion patterns atypical for recent materials. No records indicated permitted installations in the area. The diver listened, weighing each possibility against his own experience. He had learned that when explanations multiplied without satisfying resolution, direct observation was the only path forward. A remote vehicle was deployed first, descending with its cameras and lights cutting narrow cones through the darkening water. The feed was disappointing. Suspended sediment and distance reduced the object to vague contours. The cameras could not capture surface detail, nor could they convey scale accurately. The diver recognized the limitation immediately. Machines were seeing, but they were not understanding. The decision to send him down was not dramatic. It was simply the next logical step. Safety protocols were reviewed again. Gas mixtures were confirmed, redundancy systems checked, and time limits established. The diver suited up with methodical calm, sealing himself into layers of protection designed to withstand pressure, cold, and isolation. Each connection was verified by touch as much as sight. Above him, the crew prepared to monitor every parameter of his descent. As he entered the water, the surface noise faded quickly. The sea accepted him without resistance, closing overhead with barely a ripple. The descent began slowly, controlled by buoyancy adjustments that responded to subtle shifts in pressure. Light diminished as expected, first softening, then narrowing, until the world consisted primarily of the beam cast by his lamps. The seabed emerged gradually from darkness, revealing familiar elements: rippled sand, scattered stones, remnants of fishing equipment lost to time and tide. Then, at the edge of visibility, something rose that did not belong to that environment. At first, it appeared as a wall, then as a curved plane that caught the light differently than rock or wreckage. He moved closer, careful not to disturb the sediment. The form resolved into something unmistakably crafted. Smooth surfaces intersected with defined edges. As he adjusted his position, The outline extended, revealing proportions that triggered recognition not through imagination, but through accumulated cultural memory. It was the body of a horse, massive and deliberate, lying on its side as if laid down by intention rather than force. The diver circled the object slowly, documenting every angle. Coral growth clung to the surface in thick clusters, evidence of long-term submersion. The metal beneath showed a patina that spoke of age far beyond decades. Musculature was rendered with precision, the curvature of the torso and the tension of limbs frozen in an eternal stillness. This was no fragment. It was whole. He measured distances, estimated volume, and recorded surface conditions. The scale alone challenged comprehension. Constructing such an object would have required significant resources and skill. Transporting it would have demanded planning and manpower. Losing it at sea implied a failure or catastrophe of equal magnitude. Closer inspection revealed seams along the body, subtle but unmistakable. These were not cracks from damage or corrosion. They were joins, intentional lines where sections met. Near the lower torso, the diver detected features that suggested access points disguised within the sculptural form. The implications unsettled him. Statues were not built this way without reason. He transmitted his observations to the surface, keeping his tone factual, restrained. Speculation could wait. What mattered was documentation. Before ascending, he placed a marker near the object, ensuring its position could be relocated with precision. The marker's small light pulsed steadily, a modern signal beside an ancient form. The ascent followed protocol, slow and deliberate. As pressure eased and light returned, the diver's thoughts remained anchored to what he had seen. He had encountered shipwrecks that told stories of storms and commerce, and debris fields that spoke of negligence or war. This was different. This object carried intent, purpose embedded in metal. When he emerged and was helped back onto the deck, the ordinary sounds of the vessel felt momentarily out of place. Equipment hummed, waves slapped against the hull, voices exchanged routine updates. Yet everything had shifted. The footage was reviewed immediately, the images of the submerged horse commanding silent attention from the crew. No one spoke of myths or legends. They did not need to. The form itself demanded respect through its sheer improbability. The first chapter of the discovery closed not with answers, but with a collective understanding that the mission had changed. What began as a commercial survey had intersected with something older and heavier than contracts or schedules. Beneath the calm surface of the Mediterranean lay an object that resisted easy explanation, and the decision to engage with it would carry consequences beyond the scope of the original assignment. The shift from discovery to comprehension never happens all at once. It unfolds in fragments, shaped by repetition, scrutiny, and doubt. After the divers returned to the surface, the vessel did not immediately move on, despite the original schedule urging forward momentum. The coordinates of the anomaly were locked into the navigation system, marked with an importance that went beyond standard protocol. What lay below could no longer be dismissed as an undefined obstruction. It demanded attention, and attention, once given, as a way of restructuring priorities. The crew gathered around the monitors as the recorded footage was replayed, slowed, magnified, and examined frame by frame. The bronze surface caught the artificial light unevenly, reflecting not as polished metal, but as something aged and burdened by time. Coral formations clung to it in thick ridges, suggesting not decades but centuries of undisturbed growth. Marine life had claimed the figure as part of the seabed, weaving itself into contours that had once been shaped by human hands. The contrast was unsettling. Nature had accepted the object completely, while the humans now observing it struggled to place it within any familiar category. The diver watched alongside the others, though his experience of the object was fundamentally different. For him, the footage did not merely represent an image, it reawakened the memory of scale and proximity. He remembered how the horse's form had emerged from the darkness, how its proportions dwarfed him, how the stillness of it felt deliberate rather than accidental. The weight of that encounter lingered, pressing against the routine motions of life on deck. Initial discussions remained cautious and technical. The team worked through plausible explanations grounded in modern context. Could it be a contemporary art installation, lost or abandoned? That theory faltered under scrutiny. No permits existed for such a placement, and the depth alone would have made installation prohibitively complex and expensive. The corrosion patterns contradicted recent origin. Modern alloys left signatures that specialists could recognize, and this object's surface told a different story. Others proposed it might be a fragment of a larger wreck, perhaps a decorative element torn from a ship and reshaped by time. But the horse was intact, self-contained, and structurally independent. There were no signs of splintered wood, no scattered timbers or fittings nearby. It lay alone, as if intentionally separated from anything that might explain it. As the debate continued, the diver reviewed his own notes. During the dive, he had measured proportions instinctively, comparing them to his own body, to the reach of his arms, to the length of the equipment he carried. The horse was too large to be ornamental in the conventional sense. Its internal volume, suggested by the thickness of its walls and the distribution of seams, implied a hollow interior. That detail troubled him more than any other. Hollow statues existed, but not at this scale, and not assembled in such a manner. To clarify uncertainties, the decision was made to deploy the sonar again, this time focused solely on the immediate area surrounding the object. The goal was not mapping, but context. If the horse had arrived there as part of a wreck, traces should remain. The sonar sweeps revealed little beyond sediment and minor natural formations. No anchor chains, no ballast stones, no debris field that would indicate a vessel's violent end. The absence of such evidence sharpened the mystery rather than resolving it. The crew began to sense that they were dealing with something singular, not merely rare, but anomalous. The Mediterranean had yielded countless artifacts over millennia, yet few that combined scale, craftsmanship, and isolation in this way. The object resisted classification, and that resistance carried its own gravity. Attention turned back to the diver, whose observations had initiated this shift. He was asked to describe the seams again, in greater detail. He spoke carefully, grounding his account in what he had seen and touched. The seams followed lines that complemented the anatomy of the horse, disguised within musculature and natural curves. They were not random repairs or stress fractures. They were designed. Their placement suggested assembly, possibly even disassembly, an idea that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. The possibility that the object contained an interior space was now openly acknowledged. That realization changed the tone of the expedition. The horse ceased to be merely an artifact and became a structure. Structures imply use. Use implies intent. Intent implies story. Before any attempt could be made to interact further with the object, samples were required. Not large, damaging extractions, but minimal fragments that could provide data without altering the integrity of the find. The crew prepared tools designed for precision, capable of removing microscopic material from areas already compromised by corrosion. The diver did not return to the seabed for this task. Instead, a remotely operated system was guided with extreme care, its movements slower than usual, as though caution itself had weight. When the samples were retrieved and secured, the vessel's onboard lab came into focus. It was a compact space equipped for preliminary analysis rather than definitive conclusions. The atmosphere inside was tense but controlled. Every step was documented, photographed, and logged. Chain of custody mattered now. Whatever this object was, its future would depend on the credibility of the data gathered in these early moments. The analysis began with composition. Spectral readings indicated a bronze alloy dominated by copper and tin, with trace elements that did not align with modern industrial processes. The ratios echoed those found in ancient Mediterranean artifacts, though the precision of the mix suggested advanced metallurgical understanding. There were no markers of contemporary manufacturing, no residues of modern coatings or treatments. The conclusion was not definitive, but it was persuasive. The horse was old, very old. That assessment reverberated through the crew. If the object was indeed ancient, then its presence on the seabed was not merely curious, but historically significant. The diver felt a quiet shift within himself as the implications settled. He had encountered ancient objects before, fragments and remains woven into wreckage, but never something so intact, so complete. This was not history in pieces. It was history preserved in bulk. With age established as a strong possibility, comparisons followed. Reference images of known ancient bronze statues were pulled from databases, their dimensions and construction methods contrasted against the data at hand. The differences were striking. Traditional statues were solid or only partially hollow, designed for stability on land. This horse, by contrast, appeared engineered for containment. Its walls were thick enough to bear stress, yet thin enough to maximize interior volume. The seams aligned in a way that suggested modular construction. The diver listened as these points were discussed, feeling a growing sense of unease. He was trained to assess risk, and this situation carried a different kind of hazard. Not physical, but ethical. The more the object revealed itself as something extraordinary, the more likely it was to attract attention beyond the control of the crew. Governments, institutions, private interests, all would have stakes in whatever lay beneath the sea. The expedition leader faced difficult decisions. Continuing work without reporting could jeopardize the company's standing. Reporting too early could halt the mission entirely, stranding equipment and personnel in bureaucratic limbo. Yet delaying acknowledgement risked accusations of concealment. The balance was delicate, and it rested on incomplete information. A compromise was reached. External expertise would be consulted, but selectively. A marine archaeologist with whom the company had previously collaborated was contacted, provided with sanitized data that conveyed significance without revealing exact coordinates. The goal was guidance, not permission. The response was swift and measured. The archaeologist confirmed what the data suggested. The object did not fit known categories. It warranted extreme caution. Recommendations followed. Do not attempt to open or penetrate the structure at depth. Do not remove additional material beyond what had already been sampled. If possible, recover the object intact, preserving context for controlled examination. The advice was clear, and it carried weight. Lifting such a structure would be complex, but leaving it in place indefinitely was not a viable option either. Exposure to currents, corrosion, and human interference posed ongoing threats. The idea of recovery introduced new challenges. The horse's size and mass required heavy lifting equipment, precise calculations, and a stable platform. The diver contributed his assessments, recalling the object's orientation and the firmness of the seabed beneath it. He noted areas where support could be applied without stressing the seams. His familiarity with the form, gained through that initial encounter, now became an asset. As preparations began, the atmosphere on board shifted once more. Routine gave way to anticipation, and anticipation to gravity. The crew understood that they were no longer merely surveying the seabed. They were preparing to disturb something that had remained untouched for centuries, perhaps millennia. The diver felt the weight of that responsibility keenly. He had been the first to see the horse in its resting place, the first to recognize that it was not just another anomaly. Night fell as plans solidified. The vessel remained on station, its lights casting reflections across the water's surface. Below, the horse lay in darkness, unchanged by the discussions unfolding above it. The diver stood at the rail for a long time, staring into the black water. He did not think in terms of legends or myths. He thought of labor, of craft, of people who had built something immense for reasons that were no longer clear. The object without a name had begun to assert its presence, not through force, but through the questions it raised. As the expedition prepared for the next phase, it became evident that understanding the horse would require more than technical expertise. It would require patience, restraint, and a willingness to accept that some discoveries do not offer immediate clarity. They demand commitment, and they reshape those who choose to pursue them. By the time dawn returned to the horizon, the expedition had crossed an invisible threshold. The object on the seabed was no longer treated as a curiosity or a technical complication. It had become the axis around which every decision now turned. The calm of the previous night lingered only on the surface. Below deck and behind measured voices, tension had taken root, shaped by the growing awareness that the team stood at the edge of something that could not be easily contained by contracts or schedules. The consultation with the external archaeologist, brief though it had been, marked a decisive shift. The data shared had been limited by necessity, yet even that partial picture had been enough to elicit caution bordering on alarm. The specialist's response did not contain excitement or speculation, only restraint. The object, they had said, did not resemble any documented marine artifact in terms of scale, construction, or context. It did not fit established categories. That alone made it significant. More importantly, it made it dangerous to handle improperly. The diver felt this change more acutely than most. He had returned to his duties, checking equipment and reviewing footage, but the memory of the horse now carried a different weight. It was no longer just an imposing form encountered in the dark. It had become a problem that demanded interpretation. Each frame of video he replayed seemed to reveal new subtleties. The way the light slid across the bronze surface emphasized patterns that had been invisible before. Curves, once dismissed as decorative, now suggested structural reinforcement. The seams he'd noticed during the dive appeared more deliberate with every viewing, their placement too precise to be incidental. The onboard laboratory became the quiet center of activity. The micro samples taken from the object were treated with care that bordered on reverence. They were tiny fragments, almost insignificant in isolation, yet they carried the potential to answer questions that centuries of absence had left unresolved. The technicians worked methodically, aware that any contamination or misinterpretation could undermine everything that followed. Spectral analysis confirmed what initial readings had suggested. The alloy was bronze, composed primarily of copper and tin, but the ratios were unlike those used in modern industrial production. Trace elements pointed to ore sources consistent with ancient Mediterranean mining regions. There were impurities that no contemporary metallurgist would tolerate, yet which matched patterns seen in artifacts recovered from known ancient sites. The metal bore the unmistakable signature of pre-industrial craftsmanship. These results circulated quietly among the crew, provoking restrained reactions. No one celebrated. No one raised voices. Instead, a sober recognition settled in. If the horse was ancient, then its presence beneath the sea was not an accident of recent history. It was the end point of a story that had begun long before modern maps, long before sonar and steel hulls. The diver participated in these discussions sparingly, offering observations when asked. He described the thickness of the bronze plates, the way they seemed engineered to distribute stress. He spoke of the subtle overlap at certain seams, suggesting that sections had been assembled in a specific order. These were not artistic choices alone. They were functional decisions. Attention turned to comparative analysis. Images of known ancient bronze statues were pulled up, their construction methods reviewed. Most were cast in sections and joined, but their internal structures differed significantly. They were designed to stand, to endure weather and gravity, not to contain volume. The horse, by contrast, appeared optimized for enclosure. Its hollow interior, implied by wall thickness and seam geometry, was not incidental. It was central to its design. This realization marked the first moment when suspicion replaced curiosity. If the horse was built to hold something, then its purpose extended beyond symbolism or display. The diver felt an uneasy shift as this implication took hold. He had been trained to assess hazards in physical terms, but this was a different kind of risk. The object hinted at intent that had not been purely aesthetic or commemorative. The expedition leader faced mounting pressure from multiple directions. The company's headquarters requested updates, aware that delays were accumulating. Insurance considerations loomed, tied to the presence of an object that could trigger legal obligations. At the same time, the archaeologist urged restraint, emphasizing that improper handling could destroy invaluable context. The decision-making process became increasingly complex. Leaving the horse on the seabed was no longer considered a neutral option. Its discovery had already been recorded. Its coordinates existed in multiple systems. The longer it remained untouched, the greater the risk that others might find it, intentionally or not. Fishing trawlers, private explorers, even opportunistic salvagers could stumble upon it, with consequences that ranged from damage to outright theft. Recovery emerged as the only viable path forward, but it was a path lined with uncertainty. The diver contributed to the planning sessions, drawing on his memory of the seabed and the object's orientation. He described how the horse rested on its side, partially embedded in sediment, and how the surrounding area was relatively clear. This isolation, once puzzling, now offered a practical advantage. There were no entangling structures to complicate lifting. Calculations followed. Engineers estimated the mass of the bronze alone, then added conservative margins for sediment trapped within and marine growth clinging to the surface. The numbers climbed quickly, reaching figures that demanded heavy lift capabilities beyond the vessel's onboard equipment. A secondary ship would be required, one equipped with cranes capable of controlled multi-point lifts. Throughout these discussions, the diver remained aware of his unique position. He was the only one who had seen the horse directly, without mediation. The object existed for others as data and imagery, but for him it was a physical presence, a thing that had occupied space beside him in the dark. That proximity lent his assessments a quiet authority, but it also burdened him with responsibility. If something went wrong, his initial interpretation would be scrutinized. The archaeologist's guidance continued to influence decisions. Any attempt to penetrate the object at depth was strictly ruled out. If the horse contained an interior space, opening it underwater could collapse internal structures, introduce sediment, or destroy evidence that might be crucial to understanding its purpose. Recovery had to be intact, or not at all. As plans solidified, a subtle shift occurred within the crew's perception of the horse. It was no longer merely ancient metal. It had become a vessel of possibility, a container not yet revealed. The diver sensed this change in the way people spoke about it, in the care with which they referred to it indirectly, as if naming it prematurely might impose assumptions that reality could not support. The second descent was scheduled not for exploration, but for preparation. The diver suited up again, this time with a different mindset. His task was not to discover, but to enable recovery. He descended with deliberate calm, retracing his path through the water column until the horse emerged once more from the darkness. It looked unchanged, indifferent to the attention it had drawn. Working slowly, he examined the points where lifting straps might be placed without stressing the seams. He tested the firmness of the sediment beneath the torso and limbs, noting where the seabed offered support and where it might give way. Every movement was careful, guided by the awareness that any misjudgment could compromise the entire operation. He affixed markers and guidelines, ensuring that when the cranes arrived, the process could proceed with precision. As he worked, he found himself studying the horse more closely than before, tracing the lines of its form not as sculpture, but as structure. The craftsmanship was undeniable. Whoever had built this object had possessed both skill and intent, merging artistry with engineering in a way that resisted simple explanation. When he finally ascended, the weight of anticipation followed him to the surface. The crew reviewed his updates with a focused attention, adjusting plans based on his observations. The recovery operation was no longer hypothetical. It was imminent. As night fell once more, the vessel remained in position, awaiting the arrival of the heavy lift ship. The diver stood alone near the stern, listening to the low sounds of the sea against the hull. He understood now that the horse was not simply an artifact waiting to be catalogued. It was a question cast in bronze, sealed by time, and whatever lay within it had been deliberately hidden from the world. The first real suspicions had taken hold, not of danger in the immediate sense, but of complexity far beyond initial assumptions. The story beneath the sea was deeper than metal and corrosion. It was shaped by human decisions, by plans made under pressure, and by outcomes that had ended not on land, but in silence beneath the waves. The arrival of the heavy lift vessel altered the scale of the expedition in a way that could not be ignored. Until that moment, the operation had retained the feeling of a specialized survey that had taken an unexpected turn. With the appearance of the second ship on the horizon, bristling with cranes and stabilization systems, the reality of what they were attempting became unmistakable. This was no longer a matter of observation or analysis alone. They were preparing to remove something vast and ancient from a place where it had rested for centuries, perhaps longer, and every decision from this point forward carried irreversible consequences. The two vessels maneuvered carefully into position, maintaining a precise distance dictated by currents, wind, and the geometry of the lift itself. Dynamic positioning systems hummed steadily, compensating for forces that could not be felt directly but were always present. Engineers moved between consoles and deck stations, confirming calculations that had already been checked dozens of times. The bronze horse existed now not only as an archaeological mystery, but as a mass, a center of gravity, a load that had to be understood in purely physical terms if the operation was to succeed. The diver watched these preparations with a mixture of familiarity and unease. He had participated in complex lifts before, raising sunken containers, damaged vessels, even collapsed offshore structures. Those operations were demanding but conceptually simple. The objects involved were modern, their materials predictable, their failures already known. The horse was different. Its age introduced variables that could not be fully quantified. Internal corrosion, unseen fractures, stress accumulated over centuries of pressure and stillness. Any of these could cause catastrophic failure if misjudged. Before the lift could begin, the diver was required to descend once more. This final dive before recovery was not about exploration or discovery. It was about verification. Every strap placement, every contact point between metal and metal had to be assessed by human eyes and hands. Machines could simulate, but they could not feel resistance, could not sense subtle instability in the way a structure responded to touch. The descent was slower this time, deliberate to the point of ritual. The diver followed the guidelines he himself had placed earlier, the markers glowing faintly as he passed. The seabed emerged in familiar outlines, and then the horse appeared once more, unchanged, its massive form still half cradled by sediment. It seemed almost peaceful, as though unaware of the effort assembling above it. He moved methodically around the object, inspecting the lifting straps that had been carefully positioned during the previous dive. They lay flush against the bronze surface, their padding designed to distribute pressure evenly and avoid cutting into the metal. He checked for slippage, for signs that the straps might shift once tension was applied. Everything appeared stable, but he tested each section anyway, pressing gently, observing how the horse responded. As he worked, the diver found his attention drawn again to the seams. Now that recovery was imminent, their significance felt amplified. These were not weak points to exploit, but vulnerabilities to protect. He adjusted strap placement slightly in one area, ensuring that no direct force would be applied across a seam line. The decision was minor in appearance, but it reflected a deeper understanding that the object was not a monolithic block. It was an assembly, and assemblies could fail along the lines where they were joined. With the final checks complete, the diver signaled readiness and began his ascent. Above, the crew prepared to transition from preparation to action. Communication between the two vessels intensified, voices calm but precise. The timing of the lift would have to align with a narrow window of favorable conditions. Currents were predicted to weaken briefly, and wind remained manageable. Delay beyond that window would risk days of waiting, increasing costs and strain. The first tension applied to the lifting cables was almost imperceptible. Sensors registered changes long before anything was visible. Slowly, carefully, force was introduced into the system, testing responses rather than committing fully. The diver, now back on deck, watched the data feeds alongside the engineers. Stress readings climbed gradually, staying within predicted limits. The seabed camera showed sediment beginning to shift around the horse's lower edge, a sign that centuries of stillness were finally being disturbed. As tension increased, the bronze form responded. At first, nothing seemed to happen, and then Almost reluctantly, the horse began to separate from the seabed. Fine clouds of silt billowed upward, obscuring the camera's view. The engineers paused, allowing the sediment to settle enough to confirm that the lift remained stable. No sudden movements, no alarming spikes in stress. The operation continued. When the horse finally cleared the seabed entirely, it revealed something that had not been visible before. The underside showed patterns of corrosion distinct from the exposed surfaces, suggesting long-term contact with sediment rather than open water. The diver took note of this detail instinctively, recognizing that it might later contribute to understanding how the object had come to rest in that position. The ascent through the water column was agonizingly slow. The horse moved upward at a pace that felt almost ceremonial, suspended between darkness and light. Cameras tracked it from multiple angles, documenting every stage of its emergence. As it rose, the pressure surrounding it decreased, and with that decrease came new risks. Internal spaces, if present, could trap water that expanded or shifted unpredictably. The engineers monitored for any sign of imbalance. Minutes stretched into hours as the horse approached the surface. When the first hints of sunlight touched the bronze, refracted through meters of water, the moment felt unreal. The diver watched as the object crossed the boundary between two worlds. Water streamed from every contour, carrying with it traces of the seabed, fragments of history washed free by the act of recovery. Once the horse broke the surface, the scale of it became fully apparent. Even those who had seen the footage and reviewed measurements were unprepared for its presence in open air. The bronze gleamed dully under the overcast sky, its surface slick and darkened by water. Marine growth clung stubbornly to it, unwilling to release its claim. The object hung suspended above the sea, swaying slightly despite the stabilizing systems as though adjusting to gravity after centuries of relief from its full force. The transfer to the deck was the most delicate phase. The horse had to be lowered onto a prepared support structure designed to cradle its form without imposing stress. The cranes moved in unison, guided by hand signals and precise calculations. The diver remained close, watching for any sign of distortion or failure. His eyes traced the seams again, alert for changes that might indicate strain. When the horse finally settled onto the deck, the operation paused. No one moved immediately. The object lay there, immense and silent, occupying physical space in a way that no data or image ever could. The deck seemed smaller now, as though the vessel itself had been redefined by what it carried. The air was filled with the scent of salt, metal, and ancient water. Initial stabilization procedures began at once. The horse was secured with additional supports to prevent shifting as the vessel adjusted to the new load. Excess water drained slowly from cavities and crevices, forming dark pools on the deck that reflected distorted fragments of the sculpture above them. The diver watched these details closely, noting how water escaped from certain areas more persistently than others. The pattern suggested internal pathways, reinforcing the idea of a hollow structure. Cleaning was intentionally minimal. No aggressive removal of coral or sediment was permitted. Every fragment adhered to the surface was considered part of the object's history. Specialists documented the condition meticulously, photographing and scanning before any further action was taken. The horse was no longer just an object recovered from the sea. It was now an artifact under scrutiny, its treatment governed by rules that extended far beyond the expedition itself. As the day wore on, the emotional impact of the recovery began to settle in. Crew members who had approached the operation with professional detachment found themselves lingering near the horse, studying its details in silence. The diver felt a similar pull, though he resisted sentimentality. His focus remained on observation. The object had survived the lift intact. That fact alone felt significant. Yet, with the horse now exposed, new questions emerged. Subtle irregularities in the surface became more apparent under natural light. The seams, once only visible under artificial illumination, now revealed themselves more clearly. They formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. This was not merely a statue assembled for convenience. It was a structure designed with access in mind. As evening approached, the vessels prepared to depart the recovery site. The horse was secured, monitored, and logged as cargo of extraordinary importance. The diver stood back as the deck crew completed their tasks, aware that the focus of the expedition was shifting once again. Recovery had been achieved, but it was only a prelude. The act of raising the horse from the sea had transformed potential into inevitability. What had been hidden was now exposed to air, light, and human judgment. The sea had relinquished its hold, but it had not given up its secrets easily. The diver understood that the most consequential phase of the story was still ahead. The horse had been lifted, but it had not yet spoken. Once the vessels were underway and the recovery site faded into distance, the presence of the bronze horse reshaped life on deck in subtle but persistent ways. It was impossible to ignore. Even secured within its cradle of supports and restraints, it dominated the space, altering movement patterns and drawing the eye regardless of intent. Crew members adjusted their routines unconsciously, stepping wider around it, lowering their voices near it, as though proximity demanded a measure of restraint. The object had crossed a boundary. It was no longer part of the sea, yet it did not belong fully to the world above either. The first phase after recovery was stabilization and observation. Specialists resisted the temptation to interfere. Water continued to drain slowly from the horse's surface and from openings too small to be immediately identified, forming thin streams that traced the contours of its body before pooling on the deck. These patterns were documented carefully. The way water exited the structure suggested internal channels rather than random seepage, reinforcing conclusions already forming in the minds of those studying it. This was not solid bronze shaped around a core and sealed forever. It was something assembled with internal logic. Natural light revealed details that artificial illumination had masked. The patina of the bronze varied subtly across the surface, darker in some areas, lighter in others, responding to differences in exposure, corrosion, and marine growth. Coral clusters clung most heavily along the upper surfaces that had faced open water, while areas that had rested against sediment were smoother, marked by long-term contact rather than biological colonization. These contrasts told a quiet story of orientation and stillness, of an object that had not tumbled or shifted significantly since coming to rest. The diver spent long periods near the horse, not out of sentiment, but necessity. His familiarity with its form made him a natural reference point for others. When engineers or archaeologists noticed irregularities, they turned to him for confirmation. He traced seam lines with his eyes, following their paths across the torso and limbs. On deck, these seams appeared more coherent than they had underwater. They aligned with anatomical divisions that were too precise to be coincidental. Muscles and joints disguised structural boundaries, allowing access points to exist without disrupting the illusion of a continuous sculpture. Attention gradually focused on the lower torso, where several seam lines converged in a pattern that suggested intentional design rather than structural compromise. The bronze in this area showed different wear, as though it had been handled or manipulated more than the rest. Corrosion had progressed unevenly along a narrow outline that did not correspond to stress fractures or casting flaws. It looked, unmistakably, like a boundary. Before any attempt was made to interact with that boundary, formal protocols were established. The presence of an archaeologist on board became more than advisory. Every action now required documentation, justification, and oversight. The company's legal obligations expanded in real time, and communications with authorities intensified. Yet, within these constraints, there remained a narrow window in which preliminary examination could occur, provided it was non-invasive and reversible. The first step was mapping. High-resolution scans were conducted across the surface of the horse, generating three-dimensional models that revealed variations in thickness and density. These scans confirmed suspicions. Beneath the bronze skin lay an internal cavity of significant volume. The walls were thick enough to bear stress, but consistent in a way that suggested deliberate engineering. The cavity was not incidental. It was central. Within this mapped space, one area stood out. Near the rear of the torso, concealed within the sculpted anatomy, was a denser cluster of mechanisms. Metallic shapes appeared embedded within the bronze, distinct from the surrounding material. Their configuration hinted at moving parts, though centuries of corrosion had rendered them immobile. The scans suggested a locking system, primitive by modern standards but sophisticated for its time. The realization that the horse possessed a concealed access point changed the atmosphere aboard the vessel decisively. Until then, the object had been treated as an artifact to be preserved and studied. Now it was understood as a container. Containment implies content, and content implies revelation. The diver felt the shift keenly. His role as observer was giving way to that of witness to something that would soon be irreversible. Debate arose regarding the timing of any attempt to open the structure. Some argued that the horse should be transported intact to a controlled facility, where conservation environments and full laboratories could ensure maximum preservation. Others countered that internal conditions might already be degrading whatever lay inside. If water had entered the cavity during recovery, delays could cause further damage. The decision was fraught, balancing caution against urgency. The diver listened to these discussions, aware that his perspective carried weight. He recalled the patterns of water drainage he had observed immediately after recovery, the way certain channels had released water persistently, while others remained dry. That memory suggested that internal compartments existed, and that some may have been sealed more effectively than others. He conveyed this observation carefully, framing it not as conjecture, but as empirical detail. The implication was clear. If a sealed compartment existed, its integrity might already be compromised by the transition from deep-sea pressure to surface conditions. The final decision was to conduct a limited opening on deck under strict controls, focusing solely on the identified access point. No cutting of bronze would occur. If the mechanism could be engaged without structural damage, it would be attempted. Otherwise, the structure would remain sealed until proper facilities were reached. Preparation for this process was meticulous. Tools were selected for precision rather than force. Corrosion inhibitors and stabilizing agents were prepared, ready to be applied immediately if internal surfaces were exposed. Cameras were positioned to capture every moment from multiple angles, ensuring that no detail would be lost to oversight or haste. As work began, the concealed nature of the access point became even more apparent. What appeared at first glance to be a continuous sculptural surface revealed itself upon closer examination as a cleverly integrated panel. Its outline followed natural curves, invisible unless one knew where to look. The locking mechanism was partially exposed now, its metal swollen and fused by centuries of corrosion, yet still recognizable as intentional design. The archaeologist directed the process, but it was the engineers who engaged with the mechanism, using controlled pressure and specialized tools to bypass the lock without forcing it. Progress was slow. Corroded components resisted movement, threatening to seize completely if mishandled. The diver watched closely, his attention fixed on the panel itself. He noted how it responded to pressure, how the bronze flexed slightly but did not crack, how the seams held. When the final restraint yielded, it did so without drama. There was no sudden release, no violent shift. Instead, the panel loosened incrementally, as though reluctant to abandon its role after centuries of closure. As it opened, a narrow gap formed, revealing darkness within. Air, stale and heavy, escaped from the cavity, carrying with it a faint, unmistakable scent of long confined space. The vessel fell silent. Even the ambient noises of machinery seemed to recede, as though the moment demanded attention unshared. The opening was not widened immediately. Sensors were inserted first, measuring internal conditions: temperature, humidity, oxygen levels. The readings were unexpected. The interior was not fully flooded, nor was it entirely dry. It was an environment shaped by partial sealing and slow infiltration, a compromise between preservation and decay. Only after these measurements were recorded did the panel open further. The gap widened enough to admit light, and for the first time the interior of the horse became visible. What lay within was not immediately comprehensible. Shapes emerged gradually as eyes adjusted, resolving into forms that defied the initial assumptions of those present. The diver felt a tightening in his chest as he took in the sight. The cavity was not empty, nor did it contain random debris or collapsed structural elements. It held order. Human forms, reduced to bone and remnants of material, lay arranged with deliberate care. They were not piled or scattered. They were positioned. The realization that the horse had not been a hollow monument but a vessel for people struck with quiet force. No one spoke. The archaeologist's face reflected a measured shock, professional composure strained by the weight of the moment. The engineers stepped back instinctively, understanding that the nature of their work had changed irreversibly. The diver remained where he was, eyes fixed on the interior. He recognized now why the horse had been built as it was, why its seams had been disguised, why its mass had been so carefully engineered. This was not merely an object of art or deception. It was a means of concealment, of transport, perhaps of escape. As the light penetrated deeper into the cavity, more details emerged. The bones were accompanied by metal and fabric remnants that spoke of status rather than anonymity. Armor fragments caught the light dully, gold leaf clinging stubbornly to engraved surfaces. Personal items lay near each form, arranged as though intended to remain with their owners. This was not an accident of shelter. It was a planned occupation. At that moment, the expedition crossed another threshold. The horse was no longer simply an artifact recovered from the sea. It was a site of human death. Whatever had happened within its bronze walls had ended lives, and that fact imposed obligations that extended beyond archaeology or commerce. The deck of the vessel, moments earlier a workspace, had become something else entirely. The diver understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that the horse had carried its secret not as a metaphor, but as reality. And now that secret had begun to emerge, demanding interpretation, accountability, and respect. The moment the interior of the bronze horse was revealed, the expedition entered a new and irreversible phase. What had begun as a controlled archaeological examination shifted instantly into something heavier, governed not only by scientific curiosity, but by the undeniable presence of human death. The deck, still damp with seawater and streaked with sediment, felt altered, as though the boundaries of the vessel itself had changed. The horse no longer existed as a mute artifact. It had become a container of lives preserved in a state that demanded both explanation and restraint. The opening of the concealed panel was halted deliberately after the initial exposure. No one rushed forward. The archaeologist insisted on a pause, not out of hesitation, but necessity. The interior environment had to be documented exactly as it was found, before air circulation, light, and human proximity altered it further. Cameras were repositioned, lenses adjusted, angles calculated to capture every detail without intrusion. The diver stood slightly apart, his role now observational rather than active, aware that this stage required a different kind of discipline. As illumination increased incrementally, the cavity resolved into a defined space rather than a chaotic void. The interior walls of the horse were lined with bronze panels whose surfaces bore marks unlike those on the exterior. These were not the smooth curves shaped by an artist's hand, but flat, reinforced sections designed to hold form under pressure. Along several of these panels, deep scratches were visible, clustered near the access point. They cut through layers of patina and corrosion, raw and desperate, unmistakable in their intent. These were not marks of manufacture. They were the marks of human hands trapped in a confined space. The skeletal remains lay arranged in a manner that immediately distinguished them from victims of accident or collapse. There were several individuals positioned deliberately along the length of the cavity. Their bodies had been placed with care, aligned to maximize space. Each occupant afforded a defined area. This was not a last-minute refuge taken in panic. It was a planned occupation, executed with forethought and grim efficiency. The diver's gaze moved slowly from one set of remains to another, registering details with professional detachment that masked a deeper unease. The bones were incomplete in places, altered by time and partial exposure, but their orientation remained clear. Spines lay straight, limbs close to the body. There was no evidence of violent struggle between the occupants. Whatever conflict had occurred had been directed outward, toward the sealed panel, not inward toward one another. Armor fragments lay with the skeletons, confirming what the first glimpse had suggested. These were not common soldiers or anonymous passengers. The metalwork was intricate, decorated with engravings and traces of gold leaf that had survived centuries of submersion. Breastplates, greaves, and helmet components bore symbols that specialists would later associate with noble lineages and command authority. These were individuals of rank, accustomed to power and protection, reduced in death to silent witnesses within a bronze shell. Interspersed among the remains were personal effects that spoke quietly of intention. Leather water skins, now collapsed and brittle, lay empty near several of the skeletons. Their placement suggested rationing, preparation for a journey, rather than confinement without purpose. There were no food remains identifiable at first glance, only containers that might once have held provisions now long dissolved or consumed. The diver noted this absence instinctively. Water skins without food implied a short-duration plan, a transit rather than long-term concealment. The interior space bore signs of use beyond mere occupancy. The bronze panels showed areas of wear, where bodies had pressed repeatedly, where movement had occurred within the confined environment. These were not static figures sealed in ceremonial stillness. They had lived, briefly, within this space. They had shifted, adjusted, endured. The archaeologist began a slow verbal inventory for the record, describing what was visible without interpretation. Number of individuals, relative positions, associated objects. Every word was chosen carefully, stripped of conjecture. Yet, even this controlled language could not soften the reality. The horse had functioned as a vessel for human transport, and that function had ended in death. As examination continued, further details emerged. Several of the skeletons showed stress markers consistent with prolonged confinement. Bones bore subtle signs of strain, particularly in the hands and forearms, suggesting repeated exertion against resistance. Fingertips, where preserved, showed wear patterns that aligned disturbingly well with the scratch marks on the interior panels. These individuals had not accepted their fate passively. They had fought against the limits of the structure until strength failed. The diver felt an unexpected tightening in his throat as these connections formed. He had worked around death before, had seen remains recovered from wrecks and collapsed structures. Those scenes carried their own gravity, but they were chaotic, shaped by disaster. This was different. The order of the bodies, the preparedness implied by their equipment, spoke of a plan gone wrong rather than a sudden catastrophe. These people had entered the horse willingly. The question of who they were began to press against the edges of observation. The armor suggested status, but not necessarily uniform allegiance. Some pieces bore distinct motifs, others shared common design language but differed in detail. This hinted at a group assembled from related but not identical backgrounds. Advisors, commanders, perhaps members of a ruling circle. The diversity within unity suggested an elite cohort rather than a random selection. One detail drew particular attention. Near the head of one skeleton lay a set of seals and insignia crafted from precious metal and stone. These were not adornments meant for display in battle. They were tools of authority, used to mark documents, issue commands, validate orders. Their presence within the horse was significant. No one expecting to fight would carry such items into a confined space. They were carried by those who expected to emerge alive, to resume their roles once the journey was complete. The interior of the horse told a story of careful calculation. The size of the cavity matched the number of occupants closely, leaving little wasted space, but enough to accommodate them temporarily. Ventilation channels, disguised as sculptural elements on the exterior, connected to the interior through narrow passages. These channels had likely allowed limited airflow during transit. Their design was ingenious, subtle enough to avoid detection, yet functional enough to sustain life for a limited period. The fatal flaw lay in their vulnerability to the sea. Analysis of the interior walls revealed tide lines and mineral deposits indicating gradual water ingress. The ventilation channels, effective in air, had become conduits for flooding once the horse was submerged beyond its intended depth. The diver traced these patterns visually, understanding instinctively how the sea had claimed the interior space. Water would have entered slowly at first, pooling at the lowest points, reducing breathable volume, increasing humidity, and eventually overwhelming any remaining air pockets. The occupants would have realized what was happening long before the end. The scratch marks clustered near the access panel suggested frantic attempts to force it open as conditions deteriorated. Yet the lock, designed to keep the horse sealed during transport, would have resisted internal pressure as effectively as external. The very feature that ensured concealment had become a death sentence. The vessel's crew absorbed these revelations in silence. No one needed to articulate the implications. The horse was no longer an abstract symbol or an engineering marvel. It was a record of failure, of human calculation undone by circumstance. The diver felt a profound sense of intrusion, as though lifting the horse had interrupted a narrative that had ended long ago but remained intact in its stillness. From a procedural standpoint, the situation now demanded escalation. The presence of human remains transformed the recovery site into something approaching a forensic scene. Authorities would need to be notified, specialists in ancient human remains consulted, and protocols adjusted accordingly. Yet, even as these steps were initiated, the emotional impact lingered. The crew had not expected to encounter death so intimately, preserved in such deliberate order. The diver found himself returning again and again to the initial discovery on the seabed. The isolation of the horse, its careful placement, the absence of surrounding wreckage. It all made sense now. The vessel that had transported the horse must have sunk nearby, perhaps violently, perhaps quickly enough to prevent rescue or recovery. The horse, heavier than water once flooded, would have descended intact, settling gently into sediment while the rest of the wreck dispersed or decayed beyond recognition. As night fell, work on the deck slowed to a halt. The opening was secured, the interior shielded from further exposure until proper facilities could be reached. Yet sleep came reluctantly to those aboard. The knowledge of what lay within the horse followed them into the quiet hours, reshaping thoughts and assumptions. For the diver, the chapter closed not with answers, but with an acute awareness of proximity. He had been the first to encounter the horse in its long rest, and now he was among the first to witness the truth it contained. The realization that these individuals had entered the horse believing in escape, perhaps even salvation, cast the entire discovery in a somber light. Whatever story remained to be uncovered would not be one of triumph, but of intention colliding with the unforgiving reality of the sea. With the immediate shock of discovery giving way to methodical necessity, the expedition entered a phase defined by reconstruction rather than revelation. The presence of human remains inside the bronze horse demanded not only respect, but understanding. What had happened within that confined space could no longer remain a matter of impression or emotional response. It required careful, disciplined analysis, grounded in physical evidence and historical context. Only through reconstruction could the silence carried by the horse be translated into a coherent narrative. The first priority was to document the interior in its current state before any further environmental changes could alter it. High-resolution imaging captured every angle of the cavity, from the reinforced bronze panels to the precise positioning of each set of remains. The scratch marks near the access panel were mapped in detail, their depth, direction, and density recorded. They clustered in overlapping arcs, indicating repeated attempts rather than a single moment of panic. These marks were not random. They followed the contours of the panel's edges, as though hands had searched desperately for leverage where none existed. The diver participated closely in this documentation, his familiarity with confined spaces lending him insight into how the occupants might have moved within the horse. He visualized the interior not as a static chamber, but as a living environment that had changed over time. At first, it would have been dry, dark, and tense, but survivable. Gradually, it would have become humid, then oppressive as oxygen diminished and water began to intrude. Each phase would have imposed its own physical and psychological strain. Analysis of the bones revealed further clues. While centuries underwater had erased soft tissue and subtle trauma, certain indicators remained. Several skeletons showed stress-related microfractures consistent with prolonged exertion in constrained conditions. The hands and forearms in particular bore evidence of repeated strain. These were not injuries sustained in battle or sudden collapse. They spoke of effort extended beyond normal limits, of people using their bodies as tools against an unyielding barrier. The positioning of the remains suggested an agreed-upon arrangement rather than chaos. Individuals had been placed in a way that maximized the limited space, heads aligned, limbs kept close to the torso. This arrangement would have allowed them to endure the journey for as long as conditions permitted. It also suggested hierarchy and planning. Someone had organized this, allocating space and perhaps responsibility. The presence of seals and insignia reinforced the notion that authority had been exercised even within the horse. Attention turned next to the ventilation system. What had initially appeared to be purely sculptural elements on the exterior were now understood as functional channels. Thin conduits ran from the horse's nostrils and other discrete openings to the interior cavity, allowing air to circulate during transit. The design was subtle and ingenious, masking necessity within art. Yet, this ingenuity carried inherent risk. The channels were unprotected against immersion. Once submerged beyond a shallow depth, they became pathways for water rather than air. Mineral deposits inside the channels indicated a gradual influx rather than a sudden flood. Water would have entered slowly, rising incrementally, reducing available airspace over time. This detail was crucial. It meant that the occupants were not overtaken instantly. They experienced the progression, the awareness of impending suffocation or drowning, and the futile hope that the situation might reverse. The diver understood this progression instinctively, having spent years monitoring air supply and pressure underwater. The difference was that he always retained control. They had not. The likely sequence of events began to take shape. The horse had been loaded onto a vessel, likely under cover of darkness or distraction, intended to bypass a blockade or enemy surveillance. The occupants, elites rather than soldiers, entered the cavity willingly, carrying water and symbols of authority, expecting a brief and dangerous but survivable journey. The vessel set sail, relying on deception rather than force. At some point, the plan failed. Whether due to a storm, navigational error, or interception, the transporting ship sank. The speed and violence of that sinking determined the fate of the horse's occupants. Evidence suggested the vessel did not linger long enough for rescue or retrieval. The horse, heavier and more stable than wooden structures, detached or was released, descending intact as the ship broke apart or vanished. As the horse sank, pressure increased and water began to invade the ventilation channels. At first, the occupants may have believed the intrusion temporary, a leak that could be endured until rescue. They would have adjusted their positions, rationed air unconsciously, waited. As water levels rose, panic would have set in. The scratch marks near the panel recorded that moment with brutal clarity. They pressed against the lock, pulled, struck, scraped, seeking any weakness. The lock did not yield. Designed to withstand external force and conceal its function, it was impervious to desperate hands from within. The bronze walls that had promised concealment became a prison. Eventually, the remaining air would have been displaced entirely. Whether the occupants lost consciousness before drowning or endured until the end could not be known. The evidence allowed only the conclusion that death came slowly, shaped by confinement and inevitability. The diver found this reconstruction deeply unsettling. His professional life revolved around managing air, time, and pressure. He knew the sensations of oxygen deprivation, the creeping urgency, the narrowing of thought. To imagine those sensations experienced without agency or escape pressed heavily on him. Yet he remained focused on the task, aware that clarity was a form of respect. Historical context provided further structure to the narrative. Ancient naval blockades were common during periods of conflict, and deception was often employed to bypass them. The idea of using a hollow structure to transport people or goods covertly was not implausible within that framework. What made this case extraordinary was the scale and symbolism of the chosen vessel. A horse, monumental and evocative, was both a disguise and a statement. It relied on the enemy's assumptions, on their willingness to see what they expected rather than what was real. Yet unlike the legends that would later romanticize such deception, the reality revealed here was stark. The horse did not deliver victory or surprise, it delivered loss. The plan's failure erased its participants so completely that only the sea remembered them, holding their remains in silence until chance and technology intervened. The absence of surrounding wreckage became understandable in this light. Wooden hulls decayed, scattered, or were reclaimed by currents. Metal fittings corroded into anonymity. The horse, dense and intact, settled gently and remained. Its very durability ensured its isolation. The diver recalled how it had rested on the seabed, untouched by debris, as though set apart intentionally. That separation was not design, but consequence. As the reconstruction took form, the expedition's role shifted once more. The crew were no longer discoverers alone. They were intermediaries between past and present, tasked with translating physical evidence into historical understanding. Reports were drafted, combining archaeological observation with forensic inference. Each claim was carefully bounded, avoiding speculation beyond what the evidence could support. The diver contributed a section detailing the physical dynamics of submersion and air loss, drawing on his expertise to explain how the interior environment would have evolved. His language remained technical, but the implications were unmistakable. The horse had been an escape pod, and the sea had turned it into a tomb. By the end of this phase, the story had achieved a grim coherence. There were no remaining mysteries about what had occurred inside the horse, only unanswered questions about who the occupants were by name and origin. Those answers would require further study, perhaps comparison of symbols and materials with known historical records. But the core narrative was clear. As the vessel approached its destination, carrying the horse toward facilities equipped for deeper analysis, the diver felt a quiet sense of closure regarding the reconstruction. Understanding did not ease the tragedy, but it framed it. The horse was no longer an enigma suspended between interpretations. It was a testament to human ingenuity undone by circumstance and to the unforgiving nature of the sea. The tragedy, once hidden beneath layers of water and time, had been brought into focus. What remained now was to decide how it would be remembered. By the time the vessels reached port, the expedition no longer belonged solely to those who had begun it. News of the discovery, released in controlled fragments through official channels, had already spread beyond the maritime and academic communities. What had been recovered from the sea was no longer described simply as a bronze horse. It was referred to as an unprecedented historical artifact, a find that challenged assumptions embedded deeply within cultural memory. Yet, behind the measured language of press statements and preliminary reports lay a weight that could not be reduced to headlines. The port that received the ship was transformed by the arrival. Security was tightened, access restricted, and the movement of personnel monitored closely. The bronze horse was transferred under supervision to a secure facility designed for large-scale conservation and archaeological analysis. The process was slow and deliberate, mirroring the care with which it had been raised from the seabed. Every strap removed, every support adjusted, was documented. The object had become not only fragile in a physical sense, but sensitive in its implications. For the diver, the transition from sea to land brought an unexpected sense of distance. The intensity of the days spent in proximity to the horse gave way to a quieter form of reckoning. He observed from the margins as specialists took over, each bringing expertise that extended the understanding of the artifact beyond what had been possible at sea. Metallurgists examined the bronze in controlled conditions, confirming and refining earlier conclusions. Archaeologists compared symbols and construction techniques against known historical records, searching for patterns that might anchor the horse within a specific cultural and temporal framework. As analysis progressed, consensus began to form. The horse was not a symbolic replica inspired by myth. It predated the legends that would later define the concept of the Trojan horse. Instead, it appeared to be a functional prototype, a real-world application of deception that history had later transformed into metaphor. This reversal unsettled long-held narratives. The legend had not inspired the act. The act had inspired the legend, stripped of its tragic conclusion and reshaped into a story of triumph. The remains recovered from the interior were treated with the gravity they deserved. Specialists in ancient human osteology confirmed that the individuals were adults, predominantly male, though not all. Their ages suggested experience rather than youth, aligning with the interpretation that they were leaders rather than expendable operatives. Isotopic analysis hinted at varied geographic origins, consistent with an elite group assembled from allied regions or factions. These were not anonymous victims. They were people whose absence would have been felt in their time, whose disappearance may have altered the course of events beyond what records preserved. The diver attended briefings where these findings were presented, listening more than speaking. His role had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer an active participant in the unfolding investigation, but a witness to its consequences. When asked to recount his first encounter with the horse, he did so plainly, without embellishment. He described the darkness, the sudden emergence of form, the recognition that something deliberate lay before him. He avoided interpretation, leaving that to others. Public reaction followed predictable patterns. Some viewed the discovery as a validation of ancient ingenuity, marveling at the engineering required to construct such a device. Others focused on the human cost, emphasizing the tragedy that lay beneath the legend's surface. Debates emerged regarding ownership, responsibility, and display. Should the horse be exhibited, allowing the public to confront its history directly, or should it remain in restricted access, preserved as a memorial rather than a spectacle? These discussions extended into ethical territory that resisted easy resolution. Displaying the horse risked transforming suffering into curiosity. Concealing it risked erasing the lives it contained once again. Committees formed, recommendations drafted, compromises proposed. Through it all, the diver maintained a distance, aware that the artifact's future would be shaped by forces beyond individual control. Privately, he reflected on the nature of discovery itself. He had spent his career uncovering what the sea concealed, guided by contracts and technology. Rarely had those discoveries carried moral weight. This one did. It forced confrontation with the idea that progress and ingenuity are not inherently virtuous. The same creativity that enables survival can also engineer confinement and death. The horse embodied that duality perfectly. The final reports frame the artifact not as a triumph of deception, but as evidence of desperation. The elites who entered the horse had done so, believing that secrecy and ingenuity could overcome overwhelming odds. Their failure did not diminish their intelligence or resolve. It revealed the limits of control in a world shaped by unpredictable forces. Storms, structural failure, chance. These elements had intervened, rendering careful planning irrelevant. As official conclusions were published, language shifted subtly. The horse was described as a funerary site rather than a vessel. Its function as an escape pod was acknowledged, but emphasis was placed on its ultimate role as a tomb. This reframing altered public perception. The artifact was no longer associated primarily with cunning or victory. It was associated with loss. The diver visited the conservation facility once more before the horse was moved into long-term storage. Standing before it on land, he felt the difference profoundly. Without the surrounding sea, the horse appeared both smaller and more imposing. Its mass was undeniable, yet its vulnerability was clearer. The seams he had traced underwater were visible now to any attentive eye, their presence undeniable. They spoke not of artistry alone, but of access and closure. He did not touch the bronze. He did not need to. The memory of its surface, cold and unyielding beneath his gloves, was enough. He thought of the individuals inside, of their final hours, of the moment when hope would have given way to certainty. He thought of how easily their story had been overwritten by myth, transformed into a narrative of cleverness that erased consequence. In the end, the diver's role in the story remained understated. He returned to work, to contracts and coordinates and routine descents into darkness. Yet, the discovery lingered, reshaping his understanding of what it meant to find something lost. Not all recoveries restore. Some reveal costs that cannot be repaid. The bronze horse, once hidden beneath layers of water and time, now stood as a corrective to legend. It reminded those who studied it that history is not composed solely of victories and strategies, but of human decisions made under pressure and of lives that bear the weight of those decisions. The sea had preserved that truth patiently, without judgment. When it was finally brought to light, it demanded the same restraint. The price of the legend, it turned out, was not glory, but silence. And breaking that silence came with the responsibility to remember not the story that had been told for centuries, but the one that had ended unseen, sealed within bronze, far below the surface of the world. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story. Watch the following videos to uncover more real discoveries hidden by time. Share this video with others and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.